So I want you to step outside today, or even just look out a window and really stare up at the sun.
Well, maybe don't stare directly at it.
Right. Yeah, definitely don't stare directly at it. But, think about what it actually represents, because right now, in this exact moment, our sun is emitting roughly 3.7 times 10 to the 26 watts of power.
Which is, it's just an incomprehensible number. That is a 37 with 25 zeros trailing behind it. It's an output of energy that is practically violent in its scale.
It's staggering. Now, obviously, we are 93 million miles away, so only a tiny, tiny sliver of that output actually intersects with our planet.
Right.
But even that tiny sliver, the amount striking the Earth's outer atmosphere, is about 1.78 times 10 to the 17th watts.
And of course, the Earth is a highly complex physical system. So as soon as that energy hits the atmosphere, a massive portion of it is immediately reflected.
Bounced right back.
Exactly. It bounces off the tops of clouds, off the ice caps, straight back into the void of space. And then you have the hydrological cycle, right? Yeah. A huge chunk of that solar energy goes into evaporating the oceans, driving the weather systems, moving atmospheric rivers around the globe, and just dissipating as radiant heat.
But here's the kicker. Even after you subtract all of that planetary housekeeping, all the bouncing and the evaporating and the heating, we're still left with an astonishing 8.9 times 10 to the 16th watts of energy.
It's incredible.
That is free, usable power just raining down and hitting the surface of our planet every single day.
It is a profound reservoir.
Mm-hmm.
And this actually brings us to a massive perspective shift regarding biology.
Okay, lay it on me.
Consider how much of that available, usable power is actually tapped by life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If you were to take every single photosynthetic organism on the planet, so every towering redwood in California, every blade of grass in the plains, every microscopic phytoplankton drifting in the Pacific Ocean, and you calculate their combined energy usage.
It's gotta be a lot, right?
They capture a mere 0.14% of that available power.
Wait, just a fraction of a single percent.
Yeah, that translates to roughly 1.30 times 10 to the 14th watts. To frame that another way, all of life on Earth could magically increase its power consumption 7-fold overnight, and it would still leave 99% of the remaining surface energy completely untouched. Life is essentially swimming in an infinite ocean of untapped free energy.
And that number just completely broke my brain this morning, because it leads to the core question of our deep dive today. If there is so much untapped energy just constantly bombarding our planet, why is our traditional textbook view of evolution based entirely on the premise of a bitter, desperate struggle for scarce resources?
Right, because we are universally taught that nature is a battlefield defined by scarcity.
Exactly, and that discrepancy is the exact mystery we are tackling. We are pulling from a truly paradigm-shifting paper published in the journal Rethinking Ecology, authored by Owen M. Gilbert.
It's a fascinating read.
It really is. The paper is titled, Natural Reward Drives the Advancement of Life. So today we're going to explore a radical new evolutionary framework that takes a hard look at the foundational assumptions made by Charles Darwin himself.
And we will examine how one specific assumption created a hidden, century-old contradiction in modern biology.
Yes, and we'll unpack a completely new proposed force of nature called natural reward, which is a concept that actually borrows heavily from the mechanics of human economics.
I am so excited for this because it literally takes concepts from Wall Street and applies them directly to the fossil record.
It's so cool. But to really grasp this new theory, we have to start at the root of the scarcity mindset. We have to look at Darwin. If the world is practically drowning in unused solar energy, where did Darwin get the idea that resources were universally scarce?
Well, to understand that, you have to look at what Darwin was reading while he was formulating his theories. His primary influence in this area was the political economist Thomas Malthus. Malthus was writing about human populations, and he observed a fundamental mathematical trap.
The Malthusian trap, right?
Exactly. He argued that populations possess the capacity to grow geometrically. You start with 2, they become 4, then 8, 16, 32, and so on. It is an explosive compounding curve.
Right, they just multiply.
But Malthus argued that food production, so agriculture, can only ever increase arithmetically. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A linear progression.
So the compounding curve of hungry mouths inevitably smashes into the flat line of available food.
Inevitably. And Darwin took this Malthusian economic principle and mapped it directly onto the natural world.
He just copy-pasted it.
Pretty much. He reasoned that because every species has this geometric power of reproduction, the natural world must already be at absolute maximum capacity. Every niche is filled, every scrap of usable resource is spoken for.
Like there's no vacant real estate left.
Right. In Darwin's mind, the natural world is a completely full house.
And this gives us one of the most vivid and honestly claustrophobic analogies in all of science, Darwin's wedge analogy.
Yes.
He painted this picture in his writings. He said, imagine a yielding surface, like a solid block of wood, but the face of it is completely packed with 10,000 sharp wedges. They are driven in tightly, shoulder to shoulder, covering every square inch.
It is a brilliant visualization of a zero-sum game.
It really is, because if that block is fully packed, what happens if a new wedge tries to get in?
Right.
What happens if a new species evolves or a new trait emerges? You cannot simply hammer a new wedge into a solid block of wedges. The only physical way a new wedge goes in is if the sheer force of its entry pops an old wedge out.
Exactly. For a new species to survive, an older species must go extinct. The success of one is entirely dependent on the destruction of another.
Man, that's bleak.
It is. And that dynamic creates what we call comparative progress.
Break that down for me.
Because the environment is a fully packed board of wedges, natural selection is only capable of optimizing a trait for its immediate hyperlocal surroundings.
Meaning you aren't trying to be perfect, you're just trying to be slightly better than the wedge right next to you.
That is the essence of it. Think about a population of finches on an island with hard seeds. That finch isn't evolving towards some universal platonic ideal of the ultimate bird. It is simply optimizing for the very specific, immediate problem of cracking that one type of seed so it can outcompete the finch sitting on the branch next to it.
Got it.
Natural selection, under this Malthusian constraint, is just a local comparative sorting mechanism.
This is where the historical narrative hits a massive speed bump. The author calls it the Darwinian double bind.
It is a profound logical contradiction. Darwin firmly established that natural selection, this wedge-popping, zero-sum competition, creates comparative progress.
Right.
Yet he simultaneously pointed to the fossil record, to the massive diversity of life sprawling across the globe, and claimed that natural selection also drives absolute progress.
And by absolute progress, we mean the sheer expansion of life. You know, the journey from a handful of single-celled organisms floating in primordial soup to the creation of the Amazon rainforest, coral reefs, and herds of migrating wildebeests.
Exactly. And you cannot logically generate the massive absolute expansion of global biomass from a mechanism that strictly relies on a fully stocked zero-sum game.
It doesn't compute.
It really doesn't. If the wedgeboard of Earth was already completely full when life consisted solely of anaerobic bacteria, where did the physical space and resources come from to support blue whales and giant sequoias? A local sorting mechanism cannot explain a global explosion of complexity.
I imagine the heavyweights of evolutionary biology must have noticed this hole in the logic.
Oh, they did.
When the modern synthesis was happening in the mid-20th century, bringing genetics and Darwinism together, what did scientists like George Gaylord Simpson or Theodosius Dobzhansky do with this double bind?
They essentially built a wall around it and ignored it.
Really? They just ignored it.
Yeah, because during the mid-20th century, evolutionary biology was under intense cultural and political pressure from pseudoscience and creationist movements. The priority for scientists like Simpson and Dobzhansky was to present a completely unified, bulletproof scientific front. Admitting a fundamental logical flaw in Darwin's core mechanism was seen as giving ammunition to the critics.
That makes sense from a PR standpoint, I guess.
So they embraced both conflicting ideas simultaneously. They taught that natural selection is a local comparative mechanism, but also that it somehow magically results in absolute global progress.
The author of our paper refers to this as a schizophrenic state in modern biology.
It is a harsh term, but it reflects the cognitive dissonance within the field. And this unaddressed contradiction birthed one of the most persistent fallacies in how we view nature, which is teleology.
Teleology is the idea of foresight, right? The assumption of a future goal.
Yes. It is the habit of looking at a highly complex trait today, seeing how perfectly it functions now, and assuming that natural selection designed it over millions of years specifically to perform that modern function.
Oh, I see.
It implies that natural selection has the foresight of an engineer.
It makes us think evolution was playing 4D chess, planning 50 moves ahead, when in reality it was just blindly reacting to immediate local pressures.
Exactly. Natural selection is blind. It has no goals. But the double bind forces biologists to subconsciously sneak goal-oriented thinking back into their explanations just to account for the massive complexity we see.
Now, let me push back on this scarcity requirement for a second, because I've heard a counter-argument to this.
Sure.
Richard Lewontin, the famous evolutionary biologist, he posed a thought experiment arguing that you don't actually need Malthusian scarcity. Like, you don't need the struggle for existence for natural selection to operate.
Lewontin's argument is very influential, and it is taught in many universities.
Right.
He asked us to imagine a completely limitless environment. Picture a massive, infinite vat of nutrient broth. You drop in two distinct strains of bacteria, strain A and strain B.
Okay, sounds like a party.
If strain A has a genetic mutation that allows it to reproduce even 1% faster than strain B, then over time, strain A will vastly outnumber strain B.
Makes sense.
Lewontin argued that this change in population frequency is natural selection occurring in real time, completely devoid of any resource limitation or struggle.
So he's saying you can have a wedge grow larger without needing to pop another wedge out of the board as long as the board is infinite.
That's his claim, yeah.
That sounds perfectly logical on the surface. How does the author dismantle that?
If that nutrient soup is truly limitless, strain B is still happily reproducing at its own exponential rate. It might become a smaller percentage of the total population, but its absolute numbers are still exploding. Crucially, strain B is never driven to extinction by strain A.
Because there's no pressure. They aren't fighting over the same scrap of food.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Without competitive displacement, without strain A replacing strain B and forcing it out of existence.
They just peacefully coexist forever.
Right. The physical constraint of scarcity, the actual struggle for existence that forces replacement, is structurally mandatory for traditional natural selection to function.
That is a brilliant counter. I mean, if the resources are infinite, nobody loses, so nobody is selected against.
Exactly.
So this brings us to the crux of the new theory. If Darwin's struggle for existence strictly relies on the wedges being tightly packed.
What happens when you find an empty board?
Yeah, exactly. What happens when a species suddenly finds itself on an empty board?
When that happens, the biological dynamic completely shifts. It transitions from the Malthusian struggle for existence into what the author terms the struggle for supremacy.
Struggle for supremacy. Okay.
Imagine a genetic lineage that somehow unlocks a totally new, vast resource. Perhaps it is the first cyanobacteria that figure out how to harvest sunlight and perform oxygenic photosynthesis.
A huge leap.
Or maybe it's the first tetrapods, the early amphibians, that managed to pull themselves out of the crowded, predator-filled oceans and step onto the completely unoccupied, resource-rich land masses.
So they aren't fighting for survival anymore? They aren't trying to pop another wedge out?
No, they experience what biologists call a release from checks to increase. The limiting factors of starvation, intense competition, and spatial confinement just vanish.
Wow.
They're suddenly staring at an empty frontier, and the only struggle is the race to physically expand and consume as much of that new resource as possible before anyone else catches on.
Let's bring in the economic analogy here, because this is where the paper gets so incredibly illustrative. Let's compare this to the tech industry.
It's a great analogy.
Traditional natural selection is cast as the blind inventor.
Right. Think of the inventor as someone tinkering away in a messy garage. They're completely focused on solving an immediate, highly localized problem. They aren't envisioning a global empire. They just want to make a specific mechanism work.
Like Steve Wozniak.
Steve Wozniak is a classic example. He built the first Apple computer circuit boards in a garage, purely for the technical challenge and to impress his friends at the Homebrew Computer Club. He was an inventor solving local problems.
But the inventor rarely changes the world alone. You need someone to take that invention, recognize its potential in the broader landscape, and scale it. You need the entrepreneur.
And Steve Jobs was the entrepreneur. He didn't invent the circuit board, but he saw the massive, untapped consumer market for personal computers. He scaled Wozniak's invention, packaged it, and brought it to the masses.
Okay, so how does this apply to biology?
In human economics, the entrepreneur is driven by an artificial reward. If they successfully bring a novel invention to an empty market, the legal and economic system rewards them with a temporary monopoly. They reap supernormal profits because no one else can initially offer what they have.
And the paper proposes a literal biological equivalent to this, a completely separate evolutionary force, natural reward.
Yes, natural reward is nature's equivalent of the blind entrepreneur. When a genetic system, a random mutation, a new trait, a novel metabolic pathway happens to accidentally unlock a new, untapped resource, that genetic system receives a natural reward.
The environment pays out.
Exactly. And that payout comes in the form of a massive, rapid, transient population explosion. The lineage gains an absolute incumbent advantage.
To really feel the weight of this, we need to understand the mathematics of a population explosion in an empty market. It is easy to say they multiply, but the numbers are terrifying.
They really are.
The paper models this with bacteria, right?
Let's take a hypothetical bacterium. We will give it an incredibly slow reproduction rate to be conservative. Imagine it only divides and doubles its population once every 1,000 years.
In human terms, that is glacial progress. You would barely even register that it was alive.
But because biological reproduction is exponential, if that slow-growing bacterium finds an untapped resource with no competition and just doubles once a millennium, in merely 100,000 years, that single lineage will produce 10 to the 30th power members.
10 to the 30th.
Yes. That number is roughly equivalent to the total estimated number of all individual bacteria currently existing on the entire planet Earth today.
Wait, really? From one cell?
Generated by a single cell in just 100,000 years, which, on a geological timescale, is an absolute blink of an eye. This is the sheer power of the incumbent advantage.
That's mind-blowing.
The first species to stumble into a new biological market and survive expands so rapidly that they physically take over the space, consuming the resources and effectively locking out any future competitors from trying to do the same thing. They own the monopoly before the competition even realizes the game has begun. If we want to objectively measure absolute progress in nature, we should borrow from economics again. We don't judge a corporation's absolute success by how beautiful its office building is. We judge it by its market cap, its global reach, its GDP.
Right, the bottom line.
In biology, the true metric of absolute progress is population expansion and total monopolized biomass. How much physical carbon have you managed to capture and hold?
I love the example the author uses to clarify this, contrasting viruses and plants. Because the popular perception is that viruses are the ultimate evolutionary winners.
Right, because they mutate constantly, they hijack our cells, they evade our immune systems, they spread globally in months, they seem perfectly adapted.
Exactly.
Viruses are undeniably numerous, and their localized comparative progress, their ability to constantly outmaneuver immune systems, is incredibly fast. But if we measure their absolute success by biomass, the actual physical weight of the carbon they have monopolized on Earth, the narrative collapses.
What are the numbers?
The total global biomass of all viruses combined is roughly 0.2 gigatons of carbon.
And to put that 0.2 gigatons into perspective, what other group of animals holds that much market share?
Annelid worms. Mollusks.
Worms, the great, terrifying, rapidly mutating viruses, have the exact same global market cap as earthworms.
Yes.
Wow. And the plants.
Terrestrial plants, however, represent the true monopolistic winners of the natural reward game. Deep in evolutionary history, their ancestors hit upon the invention of capturing that massive influx of solar energy directly.
They tap the sun.
They unlock the ultimate untapped market. Today, terrestrial plants account for approximately 450 gigatons of carbon.
450 gigatons compared to 0.2.
Exactly. They represent the vast, overwhelming majority of all living matter on the planet. They scaled the blind invention of photosynthesis and became the dominant monopolies of Earth.
Okay, this is a perfect place to transition to the next major hurdle. We've established this two-part system. Natural selection is the blind inventor, tinkering in a crowded garage to solve local problems. Natural reward is the blind entrepreneur, taking a lucky invention, dropping it into an empty market, and scaling it into a global monopoly.
Right.
But if we are going to claim the natural reward is doing the scaling, we have an enormous burden of proof regarding the inventor.
We absolutely do. We must prove the inventor is truly blind.
Yes, we have to decisively kill the teleology delusion. We have to prove that evolution isn't secretly designing these complex traits with the future goal of tapping that market. We have to prove the reward was a total accident.
And this is arguably the most critical and challenging assumption of the entire theory to prove. The author argues that the complex, multi-step biological inventions produced by natural selection are often totally random with respect to their ultimate long-term success. The trait was absolutely not built for the reward. The massive reward was merely a happy coincidence that befell a trait that was heavily engineered to do something completely different.
We need incredibly concrete examples to ground this, and thankfully, the paper provides a masterclass in experimental evidence. Let's dive into the granddaddy of all evolutionary microbiology studies, Richard Linsky's long-term evolution experiment.
Yes, the classic experiment.
I will set the physical scene for you. Imagine a sterile laboratory. It's 1988. Richard Lenski takes a single strain of E. coli bacteria and divides it into 12 identical populations, placing them into 12 separate glass flasks.
And each flask contains a very specific liquid nutrient broth.
Now, this broth contains glucose, which is standard food for E. coli. They love it, they eat it, they multiply. But the broth also contains a chemical called citrate. Citrate is a massive, highly potent energy source, but there is a catch. In an oxygen-rich environment, which these flasks are E. coli, are physically, genetically incapable of eating citrate.
It's like putting a locked vault of gold inside a bank. The gold is there, but the tellers can't touch it.
Exactly. Lenski only included the citrate in the recipe because it acts as a chelating agent. It just helps the bacteria absorb iron. It wasn't meant to be food.
So you have an enormous untapped energy market sitting right in front of them every single day.
Taunting them.
Yeah. Now, if natural selection possessed any foresight, any teleological drive, if it was actively optimizing for the goal of unlocking that abundant citrate vault, you would reasonably expect all 12 identical populations to eventually figure it out.
But they didn't. Lenski and his team transferred these bacteria to fresh flasks every single day for decades. They tracked them for an astounding 44,000 generations.
And out of the 12 populations, only one single flask evolved the ability to metabolize the citrate.
Just one.
Just one. And the way that one population achieved it is the ultimate proof of the blind inventor. The researchers froze samples along the way, allowing them to effectively look back in time and map the exact genetic sequence of events. It took 6 distinct, completely blind selective steps.
Walk us through the mechanics of those steps, because this is where the teleology argument totally falls apart.
Step 1. The bacteria in the flask are in a Malthusian struggle. They are competing fiercely to eat the limited glucose as fast as possible. A metabolic side effect of rapidly gorging on glucose is that the bacteria excretes a waste product called acetate into the broth.
They are polluting their own environment.
Yes. Step 2. Because the glucose runs out quickly, but the broth is suddenly swimming in excreted acetate, natural selection begins favoring any mutant bacteria that can survive by scavenging and eating their own acetate waste.
Okay, so the inventor is completely ignoring the massive citrate vault? The inventor is just desperately trying to figure out how to eat garbage to survive the afternoon.
Precisely. This leads to steps 3 and 4, most notably a mutation in a specific gene called GLTA. This GLTA mutation essentially rewires their internal metabolism, making them hyper-efficient super specialists at consuming acetate.
So they are optimizing for the wrong thing, at least from the perspective of the grand prize.
But that blind optimization for acetate consumption accidentally altered their internal biochemistry in a way that set a crucial stage. Step 5, a stretch of DNA containing a gene called SIT, which normally only operates in oxygen-free environments, gets accidentally copied and pasted into a new location on the genome.
Oops.
And this new location happens to be under the control of a promoter sequence that is permanently switched on.
It's like accidentally wiring a spotlight into an outlet that doesn't have an off switch.
Exactly. This is step 6. Because their internal chemistry had already been fundamentally altered by the acetate optimizing GLTA mutation, this new permanently on SIT duplication only allowed the bacteria to perform a very weak, highly inefficient metabolism of citrate.
They crack the vault door just a fraction of an inch.
And then, step 7. We hit generation 33,500. A few final minor mutations optimize this new pathway. The bacteria cross a physiological threshold where they can suddenly effectively exploit the massive citrate reservoir. The population absolutely explodes. They completely take over the flask. The optical density of the liquid literally changes because there are so many of them. They have tapped the new market.
That's wild.
The profound takeaway here is that E. coli did not evolve citrate metabolism because the citrate was there waiting for them. The evolutionary process was blind to the citrate. The bacteria evolved a complex sequence of genetic changes purely through unrelated, immediate adaptations for surviving on waste. The massive reward came entirely at the end of the process, totally unpredicted by the local struggle that built it.
The inventor was just fiddling with scrap metal in the dark, and the entrepreneur stepped in when the resulting contraption accidentally fit a global need.
That's a perfect way to put it.
I want to shift to another example because it uses computer science to prove this exact same point about the danger of goals. It's an experiment called Pick Breeder, which Richard Dawkins famously referred to as genetic art.
Pick Breeder is a brilliant illustration of how teleology actually hinders discovery.
Yeah.
Researchers set up a public website where human users could collaboratively breed complex images. The interface is simple. You are shown a grid of random, vaguely colorful blobs. You click on the blob you find most visually interesting.
Just whichever one looks cool.
Right. The underlying algorithm then takes the digital DNA of that blob, mutates it slightly, and generates a new generation of offspring blobs for you to choose from.
Over time, by just clicking and mutating, human users managed to breed incredibly complex, recognizable images. There were distinct faces, sports cars, butterflies, even planetary systems.
But here is the crucial element. The human users were acting as blind selectors. They were just picking whatever looked novel or interesting in that specific moment. If a blob looks slightly like a wheel, they might click it. But they didn't start the process at generation 1 with the stated goal, I am going to build a sports car.
They were just following local, immediate aesthetic preference.
Exactly. So the computer scientists decided to run a control test. They wanted to see what would happen if they introduced teleology into the system.
Okay, goal-oriented evolution.
Right. They programmed an optimization algorithm with the specific, explicit goal of finding those exact complex images. The algorithm was given the final picture of the car, and it evaluated every single mutation in every generation, strictly based on a mathematical score of whether it looked more like the final car than its parent did.
It had perfect foresight. It knew exactly what it wanted. How did it perform?
It was a catastrophic failure.
Really?
After running for 30,000 generations of breeding, the goal-oriented optimization algorithm failed to produce a single one of the complex target images.
Why? What happened?
It would get stuck in local dead ends, endlessly refining a blob that sort of looked like a car bumper, but unable to take the radical divergent steps necessary to actually build the whole car.
Meanwhile, the blind human breeders, who had no goal whatsoever and were just picking for pure novelty, found the complex images in less than 100 generations.
That is the paradox of innovation. By aiming strictly for a distant target, you systematically filter out the strange, seemingly irrelevant stepping stones that are physically required to actually get there. Novelty and blind selection consistently beat optimized foresight.
Okay, we've looked at bacteria in a flask, and we've looked at digital code. Let's scale this up to complex animal behavior, because this is where biologists and, frankly, most people get very defensive about purpose in nature.
Oh, absolutely.
The author tackles the concept of kin recognition in marine animals called ascidians, or sea squirts. The teleological common sense assumption is animals evolved the ability to recognize their genetic family members specifically for the purpose of helping them survive and passing on shared genes.
It feels incredibly intuitive. But the author meticulously deconstructs this using a 5-step historical model, focusing on the cellular mechanics of how colonial sea squirts interact.
Let's visualize a sea squirt for a second.
Right.
They are marine invertebrates. They anchor themselves to rocks or boat holes, and they look like little colorful, translucent tubes or blobs.
Yes.
And some species are colonial. When two individuals touch, they can physically fuse their bodies together into a larger shared organism.
Exactly. Now, in the deep evolutionary past, ancient sea squirts likely fused indiscriminately with whoever they bumped into.
Fusion creates a massive, deadly internal conflict.
Exactly. Natural selection exerts intense local pressure to resolve this internal conflict.
So the rejection of non-kin was purely a byproduct of avoiding internal conflict.
Exactly. And the paper doesn't just theorize this. It tracks the physical evidence across different evolutionary branches. It gets deeply specific into the taxonomy.
It does, yeah. And the physical evidence beautifully supports the conflict avoidance model. The paper brings up C4 photosynthesis.
Yes, C4.
For you listening, C4 is this incredibly advanced, highly efficient biochemical pathway that certain plants use to process carbon dioxide. It is particularly effective in hot, dry environments with low atmospheric CO2 levels. It feels perfectly elegantly designed for our modern climate.
It feels engineered. And remarkably, C4 photosynthesis has evolved independently at least 66 different times across various plant lineages. This independent repetition is often cited as proof that evolution was aiming for this optimal solution.
To get to C4, a plant first has to evolve an intermediate mechanism known as C2 photosynthesis.
C2 photosynthesis is an intermediate, messy patch job. But once those C2 metabolic pathways were established, they accidentally provided the raw physiological scaffolding necessary.
And when global CO2 levels dropped millions of years ago,
the plants holding the C4 invention found themselves uniquely capable of dominating the new, arid, carbon-starved environment. They scale globally, forming the massive grasslands and savannas we see today. The invention was local and blind, The reward was global and absolute.
Okay, my mind is thoroughly blown by the scale of this, but we are only moving into the second half of our deep dive.
There's so much more.
So let's take these two newly separated forces, natural selection as the localized, blind inventor, and natural reward as the scaling, blind entrepreneur, and use them to solve some of macroevolution's greatest mysteries.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's start with a biological behavior that makes absolutely no energetic sense: sexual reproduction.
From a purely thermodynamic and Malthusian standpoint, the prevalence of sexual reproduction is one of the greatest paradoxes in biology.
Why is that?
Think about the costs involved. An asexual organism, like a bacterium or a whiptail lizard, simply clones itself. Every individual can reproduce. It is highly efficient. Why is sexual reproduction ubiquitous across almost all complex life?
Traditional evolutionary arguments usually point to genetic variation. Scientists like Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould often focused on the concept of evolvability.
Yes, evolvability.
They argued that by mixing genes from two parents, a population generates a wider variety of traits in its offspring. This variation acts as an insurance policy, allowing the population to adapt more rapidly to changing environments, diseases, or predators.
The Red Queen hypothesis is a famous example of this, running as fast as you can just to stay in the same place against parasites. But the author argues that these evolvability arguments fall right back into the Malthusian trap.
How so?
Because they implicitly assume a world governed entirely by strict zero-sum resource limitation. If the world is a fully packed board of wedges, then increased genetic variation just makes your offspring slightly better at competing locally against the wedge next door.
I see.
It explains comparative survival in a tight spot. But it fundamentally fails to explain the absolute spread and the massive global success of sexual lineages over asexual ones. The author proposes that sex spread because the physical mechanics of sexual reproduction accidentally unlock a backdoor to unprecedented genomic novelty.
A backdoor to novelty.
Specifically, sex allows for extensive hybridization between closely related lineages, and crucially, it facilitates the rapid horizontal spread of transposable elements throughout a population.
Transposable elements. These are often referred to as jumping genes, right?
Yes.
Let's break down the mechanics of that because it sounds like science fiction. What physically happens when a gene jumps?
A transposable element is a specific sequence of DNA that possesses the biochemical ability to copy itself and physically insert that copy into a completely new random location within the host's genome.
Okay.
Imagine reading a highly technical manual and suddenly an entire paragraph copies itself and pastes itself right into the middle of the following chapter.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster. If you paste a random paragraph into the middle of instructions on how to build a heart valve, you break the valve.
And that is exactly what happens in the short term. Transposable elements are often highly destructive. They are a massive local cost to the organism.
So why on earth would the entrepreneur scale a system that encourages genetic sabotage?
Because over vast periods of time, while 99% of those jumping genes cause damage, that 1% produces radical, sweeping genomic restructuring. By randomly copying, pasting, and shuffling sequences of DNA around, transposable elements accidentally rewire gene regulatory networks. They duplicate existing tools, allowing the copy to mutate and take on an entirely new function while the original maintains the old function. They reshuffle the genetic deck in wild, entirely unpredictable ways.
And when you wildly, relentlessly reshuffle the deck over millions of years, eventually, statistically, you're going to pull a royal flush.
Precisely. You stumble into a completely new, wildly divergent phenotype. You develop a physiological architecture that unlocks an entirely untapped biological resource. You find an empty market, natural reward kicks in, and the population explodes into the new space.
So sex didn't spread because it's a perfectly optimized, elegant system of heredity.
Not at all. It spread because it acts as a chaotic, blind engine for generating the radical novelty required to accidentally stumble into massive natural rewards.
This seamlessly segues into the next great macroevolutionary mystery, the fossil record, and specifically the problem of sudden appearances.
The huge debate topic.
If you talk to anyone skeptical of evolution, or even if you read deep into Stephen Jay Gould's theories on punctuated equilibrium, they point to the rock layers and highlight a glaring issue.
The lack of transitional forms.
Right. They say, look at the strata. You have millions of years of nothing but simple marine life, and then suddenly, boom, the Cambrian explosion. A fully formed, incredibly complex new body plan just appears out of nowhere in the rock.
It looks instantaneous.
The traditional Darwinian model of slow, gradual, comparative progress suggests there should be thousands of intermediate, slightly better fossils leading up to the new species. But they often aren't there. Did the animal just magically mutate an entire limb in one giant leap? Or were the millions of transitional fossils just conveniently destroyed by erosion?
This specific lack of transition has been a headache for paleontologists for over a century. But let's bring the conversation back to the Linsky E. coli experiment, because it provides a flawless, mathematically observable mechanism to solve this exact mystery.
Oh, I love a good callback.
Remember the crucial precursor mutation, the bacteria, the GLTA mutation?
Yes. Step 4, the mutation that made them super specialists at eating their own acetate waste, which accidentally set the stage for eating citrate later.
Now, consider the timeline of the experiment. At generation 30,000, the bacteria carrying that specific vital GLTA mutation absolutely existed in the flask. They were physically there.
Right.
But because they were caught in a brutal Malthusian struggle over the limited acetate, they were incredibly rare. They constituted far less than 1% of the total bacterial population in the flask.
They were losing the numbers game.
Significantly. If a microbiologist were to take a standard random sample of the fluid at generation 30,000 using typical sequencing tools, those transitional mutants would be completely invisible.
Really, just completely invisible.
Standard detection methodologies generally require a variant to be present at a frequency of at least 1% to 5% to be reliably detected against a background noise. To our instruments, the transitional form did not exist.
They were essentially ghosts in the machine.
Exactly. They were a rare, struggling, highly localized transitional form, barely clinging to survival. But then, roll the clock forward. Generation 33,500.
The breakthrough.
They acquire the final CT duplication, they hit the physiological threshold, and they access the massive citrate reservoir. Natural reward takes over.
Yeah.
Because they are the only ones who can eat the citrate, their population expands exponentially.
Wow.
Within a matter of weeks in the lab, they surge from being less than 1% of the population to representing over 99% of the biomass in the flask.
Oh, wow. I see where this is going. If you were a paleontologist looking at this as a frozen fossil record in rock strata,
It looks exactly like a sudden magical leap. At the rock layer corresponding to generation 30,000, you see absolutely nothing. At the rock layer corresponding to 33,500, you see a fully formed, metabolically distinct, completely dominant new species.
the transitional forms were there all along.
Yes.
They didn't make a giant genetic leap, and the fossils weren't lost to erosion. They were just the blind inventor tinkering in the dark, keeping the population at a tiny, geographically isolated, totally undetectable level. And then the entrepreneur scaled them up so fast that it registers as a sudden explosion in the historical record.
That is the crucial insight. The sudden appearance in the fossil record is not a sudden leap in genetics. It is the sudden leap in population scale. Natural reward takes a rare, invisible invention and rapidly scales it into fossil record visibility.
That reframes the entire history of life.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the third massive mystery covered in the paper, the standard genetic code.
This is one of the most profound uniformities in all of biology.
Almost all life on Earth, from a giant redwood tree to a portobello mushroom to the bacteria in your gut to you and me, translates its DNA into functional proteins using the exact same biochemical alphabet.
It's universal.
It is a 3-letter code. 3 bases of DNA, called a codon, correspond to one specific amino acid.
And if you do the math on the possibilities, the uniformity becomes staggering. There are 64 possible 3-letter codons, and they map to 20 standard amino acids. The number of possible ways you could assign those 64 codons to those 20 amino acids is roughly 21 to the 64th power.
That is an astronomically huge number.
It is a number so large it defies human comprehension. Yet out of 21 to the 64th power possible languages, virtually the entire biosphere uses just one. Why?
Well, the teleological urge, the old way of thinking, is to immediately assume, well, if everyone uses it, evolution must have relentlessly optimized it. It must be the single most mathematically perfect, structurally robust code possible.
But statistically, the odds of primitive, blind life stumbling upon the absolute most optimal code out of 21 to the 64th power options on the first try are practically zero.
So if it's not optimal, what is it?
The author argues that our standard genetic code is not the optimal biological product. Rather, it is a market monopoly.
Okay, here's an analogy that I think makes this abstract concept click perfectly. Think about the use of the English language in global science today.
Oh, this is a great comparison.
If you are a researcher publishing a groundbreaking paper in physics, biology, or computer science, you write it in English. Now ask a linguist. Is English the most optimal, strictly logical, perfectly structured language for conveying rigorous mathematical and scientific concepts?
Absolutely not. English is a notorious linguistic chimera. It is full of clumsy rules, contradictory spelling exceptions, and bizarre historical baggage borrowed from French, Latin, and Germanic roots. It is arguably a terrible language for strict precision.
But why is it the universal language of science? It's not because of its structural perfection. It is because during the scientific and industrial revolutions, early British scientists like Isaac Newton and later American institutions had a massive early impact on the global stage.
They published extensively. English became incredibly abundant within the specialized scientific community.
Right. And today, if you are a brilliant young scientist working in a lab in Tokyo or Sao Paulo, using English gives you an immediate incumbent advantage. By adopting the dominant standard, you instantly gain access to the largest existing pool of research, the most prestigious journals, and the widest network of potential collaborators.
It's practical.
You use English not because it's perfect, but because using a different, theoretically better constructed language would isolate you from the market.
The exact same market dynamics apply to the evolution of the genetic code. Deep in the primordial soup, early in the history of life, there were likely several primitive organisms experimenting with various functional codes.
Right.
Whichever organism happened to multiply the fastest, perhaps because they found a good local energy source, made their specific, arbitrary genetic code the most physically abundant in the environment.
They flooded the market with their specific translation manual.
Yes. Now imagine other early life forms in that shared environment. They are constantly interacting, swapping loose genetic material, a process called horizontal gene transfer. An organism that utilized the dominant, abundant code could easily absorb and integrate genetic innovations produced by its neighbors.
Because they speak the same language.
Exactly. An organism using a different proprietary code could not. Using the dominant standard gave them immediate access to the largest pool of biological innovations floating around in the ocean. It is a massive incumbent advantage that rapidly, exponentially locked out all the other 21 to the 64th possibilities.
So we share a genetic code not because of biological optimization, but because of ancient biological market dominance.
That's the theory, and it holds up remarkably well.
I love how seamlessly we are applying Malthusian scarcity and market monopolies to deep biochemistry, and that leads us directly into our final major exploration.
The big one.
Let's look at the ultimate, most dramatic historical example of an incumbent biological monopoly being violently shattered, and how that event directly paved the way for us sitting in this studio having this conversation, set the stage for us deep in the Earth's past.
We need to travel back roughly 240 million years to the Triassic period. Following a previous mass extinction, a specific lineage of reptiles begins to radiate. These are the dinosaurs, alongside the massive marine reptiles in the oceans.
Okay, picturing it.
Over tens of millions of years, they evolve, they adapt to every major ecological niche, and they take over completely. They become the ultimate biological monopolies. From the massive long-necked sauropods stripping the forest canopies to the apex predators like the ancestors of T-Rex, they held an absolute incumbent advantage across virtually all major terrestrial and marine ecosystems.
The wedgeboard of the planet was completely jammed with scales and teeth. Every slot was filled. Now, importantly, mammals were not a later invention. Mammals existed very early on in this timeline, around 200 million years ago. We were there, scurrying around in the dark underbrush of the dinosaurs world.
We were the blind inventors confined to the garage.
The garage phase.
During that 140 million year period under the rule of the dinosaurs, early mammals were intensely subjected to the local comparative struggle for existence. Because they were forced into the nocturnal, hidden margins of the world to avoid being eaten, they evolved incredible, complex adaptations.
Like what?
They developed placentae for extended internal developmental care of offspring. They evolved mammae for feeding young in the dark. They developed highly complex, differentiated teeth for processing diverse, scarce food sources. They evolved larger brains, acute hearing, night vision, and warm-blooded metabolisms.
They had all the incredible technical specs of a revolutionary product, but they couldn't scale it.
They absolutely could not scale. They could not radiate into large body sizes, and they could not conquer the daytime niches because the dinosaurs already owned the market. The biological monopolies were too entrenched. The physical constraint of the existing wedges prevented the mammalian inventions from ever receiving a natural reward.
Until the greatest market crash in planetary history.
66 million years ago.
66 million years ago, a 6-mile-wide rock, the Chicxulub asteroid, slams into the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula.
It was the ultimate indiscriminate biological antitrust action.
That's a perfect phrase. Biological antitrust.
The physical impact, the ensuing global firestorms, the acid rain, and the years of atmospheric ash blocking out the sun caused an environmental catastrophe of incomprehensible scale. It wiped out virtually every vertebrate terrestrial animal weighing over 50 pounds.
The large dinosaurs, the massive marine reptiles, the pterosaurs, they were entirely annihilated.
The incumbent monopolies went bankrupt overnight. The massive ancient wages were violently ripped out of the board.
The ecological zone was abruptly and violently cleared.
And this is the precise moment when natural reward kicks into overdrive. The surviving mammals, possessing all of those highly developed, complex inventions that had been suppressed and refined in the dark for 140 million years, suddenly stepped out into a cleared ecological landscape.
The crushing constraint of the dinosaurs was lifted.
The market was empty, and they had the perfect product.
They radiated with breathtaking speed over just the next 10 million years, which, geologically speaking, is an incredibly short window. Placental mammals expanded exponentially in body size. They diversified their forms, adapting into runners, climbers, burrowers, and swimmers.
They completely took over the terrestrial and marine environments left vacant by the dinosaurs. The blind inventions of the garage were finally rewarded with global monopoly.
And that sprawling mammalian radiation eventually branches down the evolutionary tree to primates, to hominids, and eventually to Homo sapiens, to us.
Right.
And the author makes the fascinating point that humans are the ultimate unprecedented beneficiaries of natural reward. Because we didn't just fill an empty physical space. We found a power source that no other biological organism in the history of the planet had ever truly tapped.
Fossil fuels.
Yeah.
For millions of years, biological matter had been dying, compressing, and storing the sun's ancient energy underground in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas. When humans developed the technological capability to extract and burn those resources, we tapped into a reservoir of millions of years of stored solar energy.
We unleashed an entirely new power source, granting us a release from checks to increase that dwarfs the mammalian radiation.
But the paper takes this narrative one step further, and this is where it gets incredibly meta and relevant to our modern society. We didn't just passively benefit from the mechanics of natural reward. As human societies developed, we codified it into our laws.
This part is so fascinating.
If you look at a macroscopic chart of human global gross domestic product over the last few centuries, and you overlay it on a biological chart of terrestrial species biomass growth following the asteroid impact, the exponential curves look nearly identical. It's a massive hockey stick shape. Why?
Because human civilization quite literally wrote the underlying mechanics of natural reward into our legal and economic systems. We intuitively recognized that to achieve absolute progress, technological and economic expansion, we needed to structurally separate and legally protect the two forces, the inventor and the entrepreneur.
The paper highlights the specific legal frameworks we built to do this. Think about patent laws. You can trace this back to the letters patent issued by Queen Elizabeth I, and it is enshrined directly in Article 1 of the United States Constitution.
Right.
A patent is a legal, governmental guarantee that the blind inventor, the person sweating over a workbench in the garage, will receive an artificial reward and protection for their localized novelty.
And then you pair that with contract laws. Contract laws ensure that the entrepreneur, the individual or corporation that recognizes the utility of the invention, builds the supply chain, coordinates the labor, and scales the product to the masses, is legally protected and guaranteed to reap their monopoly profits.
Exactly. By enforcing patents and contracts, human societies artificially simulate the incumbent advantage of nature, We construct a secure, artificial, empty market to incentivize economic expansion.
It's unbelievable when you frame it that way. We built the scaffolding of our entire modern world by legally mirroring the exact evolutionary mechanism that allowed the mammals to conquer the planet after the asteroid hit.
It's a perfect parallel.
But of course, human history also demonstrates that we learned the inherent danger of this system. What happens when an entrepreneur gets too successful?
Well, they become the new dinosaurs.
Yeah.
They evolve from a dynamic, scaling entrepreneur into an entrenched, suffocating monopoly. Think of Standard Oil or the massive railroad conglomerates of the 19th century.
Right.
When a corporation becomes too dominant, it fills up the economic wedgeboard completely. It begins aggressively suffocating the blind inventors beneath it, buying up or crushing any localized novelty that threatens its market dominance.
In nature, as we saw, it takes a literal 6-mile-wide rock falling from space to clear that kind of entrenched monopoly. But humans invented a legislative workaround so we don't have to wait for the sky to fall.
We invented antitrust laws.
The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Clayton Act. These are legal mechanisms designed specifically to target and dismantle the dinosaurs of industry.
When a corporation reaches a level of dominance where it stifles all secondary innovation, the government steps in as an artificial force of nature and forcibly breaks the monopoly apart into smaller, competing pieces.
We deliberately simulate a mass extinction event, but we manage to do it without the actual death, the darkness, and the centuries of global ecological depression.
Exactly. We artificially clear the upper canopy of the market so that sunlight can reach the underbrush once again. We deliberately legislate a temporary void, a release from checks to increase so that new suppressed innovations can emerge, be naturally rewarded, and scale. Our modern legal system is fundamentally an incredibly sophisticated, managed simulation of the deep-time macroevolutionary cycle.
Okay, we have covered an absolutely massive expanse of biological and historical ground today. Let's try to summarize this journey for you listening, because it is a profound shift in perspective to hold in your head all at once.
It's a lot to take in.
We started with the realization that we live in a universe that is practically drowning in free, unused solar energy. We saw how Charles Darwin, deeply influenced by the Malthusian economics of human agriculture, erroneously assumed a world defined by strict zero-sum scarcity.
An assumption that created a 150-year-old double bind in evolutionary biology, forcing scientists to try and explain the absolute sprawling global progress of life using a mechanism that was only ever mathematically capable of localized comparative sorting.
Right. And that contradiction birthed the teleological delusion, the false, comforting belief that nature acts as a designer, planning ahead and building complex traits for future goals. And we learned how Owen Gilbert's paradigm-shifting paper proposes a radical, elegant solution to this bind, separating the advancement of life into two distinct, unguided forces. The blind inventor of natural selection, who tinkers locally and clumsily to solve immediate survival problems, completely unaware of the future.
And the blind entrepreneur of natural reward, the force that takes those localized, random biological inventions and, when they happen to accidentally unlock an abundant, untapped resource, rapidly scales them into global incumbent monopolies.
We traced how this dynamic solves the mysteries of bacterial evolution in the Linsky experiment, the deceptive appearance of sudden leaps in the fossil record, the monopolistic dominance of our single universal genetic code, and the rise of mammals from the ashes of the Chicxulub impact.
And this entire framework matters deeply to you in a very immediate, practical way. Whether you are leading a startup, designing a new piece of complex software, writing a novel, or just trying to navigate the unpredictable trajectory of your own career path, you must remember the fundamental lesson of the blind inventor and the blind entrepreneur.
It's a huge lesson.
True. Paradigm-shifting innovation almost never comes from rigid, forward-looking teleological optimization. If you strictly define your final goal and only allow yourself to take steps that logically move you toward it, you risk becoming like the optimization algorithm in the pick breeder experiment, stuck in a localized dead end, endlessly refining a bumper while failing to build the car.
You completely blind yourself to the necessary weird stepping stones.
Precisely. Often the greatest advancements, the true leaps in absolute progress, come from giving yourself permission to be the blind inventor tinkering in the garage. It comes from focusing on solving immediate local problems, allowing for playful novelty, generating a diversity of ideas, and then, crucially, being observant enough to recognize when that localized novelty surprisingly meets a massive, untapped opportunity in your broader environment. You cannot always predict or engineer the reward, but you can relentlessly keep tinkering until you accidentally stumble into it.
That is an incredible reframing of how to approach creative work. Keep diving deep.